This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can find all the cards in this video in their store by using the links in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nita Hone, and it's time for another MTG Top 10, the series where I rank cards based on their historical performance at Magic's highest level of competition. Today we're looking at X burn spells. In Magic, a burn spell is a spell that can damage the opponent, and an X spell is one that has X in its casting cost. X burn spells have been part of Red's identity in Magic since the beginning. There are actually 3 cards that do it in Alpha. X burn spells aren't super efficient, you often end up overpaying for the damage by at least 1 mana, but their flexibility tends to make up for that. They can scale up as the game goes on since they do more damage the more mana you have, and if you've got an X spell that can hit creatures as well as players, they tend to get even better. To be eligible for this list, a card had to have X in its casting cost, and it had to be able to damage the opponent. In all, there were 91 cards eligible for this video, and in it we'll look at the 10 that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic. Before we get started, here's a quick reminder on how I score cards in these videos. A first tier top 8 is worth 2 points, this includes events like Pro Tours, and a second tier top 8 is worth 1 point. This includes events like Regional Championships. Alright, let's take a look at the top 10 X burn spells in Magic, starting with our number 10 card, which is Crater's Claws. For X and a red, this sorcery deals X damage to target creature or player, and it comes with Ferocious. This teamer mechanic means you get a bonus if you have a creature with 4 or more power in play. In this case, Crater's Claws does X plus 2 damage. I mentioned in the intro that X burn spells aren't typically very efficient, but if you can get Ferocious going here, Crater's Claws can feel pretty impressive. I mean, paying 4 total mana to do 5 to any target isn't too shabby. And it also means you can pay 1 red mana for 2 damage, making the card a lot more flexible. It gained all of its points in Standard between 2014 and 2015, where it was played in Gruul aggro decks with tons of creatures that could get you to Ferocious, as well as in Devotion to Green decks, which could pump a bunch of mana into it using Nykthos. It does see some play in Pioneer Gruul aggro decks, but those haven't put up a top 8 at a major event just yet, so it hasn't gained any points since 2015. At number 9, it's Devil's Play. For X and a red, it does X damage to any target, and it has flashback for X and 3 red. This means you can cast it from your graveyard by paying that cost and exiling it. Because of flashback, this X burn spell has the chance to do X damage twice, which can net you a 2-for-1, or just be used to finish off your opponent. In Block Constructed, Devil's Play was played in Naya and Jund aggro decks, and in Standard it was in Primeval Titan decks, which are great at amassing a ton of lands in order to do lots of damage with Devil's Play. It hasn't gained any points since rotating out of Standard. At number 8, it's Drain Life, the only card on the list that isn't red. While red gets most of the X burn spells, black does get X spells that can damage the opponent on occasion, including on this card from Alpha. For X, 1 generic and a black, Drain Life does X damage to any target, and you gain life equal to the damage dealt, but it's capped by the creature's toughness, the planeswalker's loyalty, or the player's life. You can also only spend black mana on X. Tacking life gain onto an X burn spell is pretty awesome. If you're behind, it can go a long way towards pulling you back ahead, and it can also enable some pretty silly shenanigans when combined with cards that let you pay life. In Mirage Block Constructed, it was the win condition in a deck that could produce a ton of mana by using Cadaverous Bloom and Squandered Resources. This Prosbloom deck utterly dominated the format and had to be banned out of it. In Standard and Extended, it was utilized in Necropotence decks, so that those decks would never run out of life, and could just keep on drawing more cards with the powerful enchantment. Drain Life's best days are definitely behind it. It doesn't have any points since 1997, but it was a key card in the Magic scene of the mid-1990s, helping power 2 of the most broken decks in the history of the game. At number 7, it's Conflagrate. For X, and a red, it does X damage divided as you choose among any number of target creatures or players. Like Devil's Play, it's an X burn spell with flashback. In this case, you can pay 2 red and discard X cards. Unlike the other X burn spells we've seen so far, this one can divide the damage, which is some pretty amazing upside to have, as you can use it potentially to wipe out the opponent's board, in addition to still being capable of finishing off the opponent. Despite being printed in 2006, Conflagrate didn't top 8 its first major event until 2011. Finding a way to really abuse it was kind of a challenge, since it costs a ton of mana to cast from your hand, and a ton of cards to cast from your graveyard. It's gained all of its points in Modern, first finding success in Ad Nauseam decks, which look to draw a ton of cards, and it can use Conflagrate as a win condition when it's in the graveyard. It's found more success, though, in Dredge decks, which specialize in rapidly loading up the graveyard. In that deck, it isn't used as a win condition so much as an early game tempo play that lets you discard a bunch of cards you want in your graveyard anyway, while also wiping out part of the opponent's board. Conflagrate doesn't see an enormous amount of play in Modern, but it does see consistent play, so it has a good shot at maintaining a spot on the list going forward. At number 6, it's Earthquake, one of the X burn spells from Alpha. It's a sorcery that costs X and a red to do X damage to each creature without flying and each player. It was a heavily played card in Magic's early days, showing up in a top 8 at pretty much every event it could between 1995 and 2000. It was played in control decks, but also in aggro decks, since it could also be useful as a finisher against an opponent who stabilized. It was reprinted regularly in core sets for years, giving it multiple shots in Standard. Anytime it was legal there, it saw some play. Its last reprint came in M10, and even though that was long after it was first printed, Earthquake was still relevant and managed to make top 8s. However, it doesn't have any points since 2010. At number 5, it's Banefire. For X and a red, it does X damage to target creature or player, and if X is 5 or more, it can't be countered and the damage can't be prevented. It's gained most of its points in Standard, and it's benefited from 2 separate runs through it, one from its original printing in Conflux, and another from a Core Set 2019 reprint. Both times it showed up in the main deck and sideboards of red decks of all varieties, including control, midrange, and aggro. More recently, it's found success in Pioneer, where it's a win condition in some Lotus Field ramp decks, which seek to produce a ton of mana for a lethal, uncounterable, unpreventable Banefire, and it even has a point in Legacy where it's appeared in Mono Red Storm. It looks likely that it will gain more points in the future. At number 4, it's Fireball, which like Earthquake is an alpha X burn spell, and for me at least, it's the first card I think of when I hear X burn spell. For X and a red, it's a sorcery that does X damage divided evenly among any number of targets, but you have to pay 1 generic mana extra for each target beyond the first. It's been an iconic and powerful card since even before Tournament Magic was a thing. This is because, like all X burn spells, it has serious combo potential, since if you can produce enough mana, it can do lethal right away. This was very possible in Magic's earliest days thanks to a lot of fast mana, and especially Channel. The dreaded Channel Fireball combo was a big factor in the introduction of rules that limited a player to being able to play only 4 copies of a card per deck, because if you loaded up your whole deck with fast mana like Moxen and Lotuses and like 20 copies each of Fireball and Channel, you just win on turn 1 every single game with a lethal Fireball. Obviously, that's not exactly how they wanted Magic games to go. Channel also had to be restricted before Magic's first World Championship because they didn't want too many games determined by the combo, which would have been the case if you could play a full 4 Channel and a full 4 Fireball. Even so, all the top decks at that event ran Fireball and the 1 Channel they were allowed, since if you got the right draw, you could still go off on turn 1. Thanks to reprints, Fireball also saw play in other standard formats that had decks capable of producing tons of mana, such as Krark Clan Ironworks decks, which could sack a bunch of artifacts to do lethal, and Primeval Titan decks, which could get lots of lands in play in a hurry. Fireball doesn't have any points since 2004. If it ever gets another standard reprint, it does have a chance at finding more success, though it is certainly a little clunkier these days than it was back in the day. At number 3, it's Ragdos Return. For X a black and a red, this sorcery does X damage to an opponent and makes them discard X cards. This is the only card on the list that can't also damage creatures. Ragdos' Return makes up for that though by completely disarming your opponent when you cast it. Doing a bunch of damage to your opponent and putting them in top deck mode is a pretty good way to get an advantage. While it was in Standard, it was played in Jund, midrange, and control decks, and more recently it's been featured in Pioneer, Niv, Mizzet, Reborn decks, a deck which is very interested in powerful 2-color cards like the Return, since Niv can draw them for you. It's likely to gain more points in Pioneer in the future. At number 2, it's Bonfire of the Damned. For X, and a red, the Bonfire does X damage to target player and each creature he or she controls. That's already an incredibly powerful effect that often feels like you've stapled a one-sided Wrath to Fireball. But that's even more true because the Bonfire has Miracle. This means if it's the first card you draw in a turn, you can reveal it to your opponent, and if you do, you pay an alternate cost. In this case, you only have to pay X once, making it way more efficient. It was simply one of the most powerful cards in both the block and standard formats it was part of, and it's found more sporadic success in formats like Legacy and Modern. It's likely to keep gaining points, although it doesn't have any so far in 2024, but it still has some chance to catch the number 1 card on the list, because most of its success seems to be behind it, and that card is Expansion and Explosion. This is a split card, which means you can choose to cast one side or the other. The Explosion side is what qualifies it for this list. For X, 2 blue and 2 red, it's an instant that does X damage to any target, and target player also draws X cards. That's a way more expensive X burn spell than the others we've seen, but it's also an instant, and it can draw you a bunch of cards, and on top of that, unlike most X burn spells, which tend to not be very good in the early game, you also have the option to cast Expansion early. An instant that costs 2 red-blue hybrid mana and lets you copy an instant or sorcery with a mana value of 4 or less, and you choose new targets for the copy. Expansion and Explosion gain most of its points in standard Wilderness Reclamation decks. That powerful enchantment allows you to effectively double your mana every turn as long as you're operating at instant speed, which Explosion allows you to do. These decks also found some success in Pioneer. This deck was so effective in both formats that Wilderness Reclamation ultimately got banned out of both. It kept seeing play after the ban in Standard though, in adventure decks that could use Fate of Wishes to grab Expansion and Explosion out of the sideboard, something worth doing once you had a ton of mana. Still, Expansion and Explosion hasn't gained any points since 2022, and Bonfire of the Damned and Ragdos Return might pass it in the long run. So those are the top 10 X burn spells in Magic. If you want to do X damage to your opponent, check out the description, where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If you enjoyed this list, do me a favor and like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you're caught up on the over 700 other MTG top 10s, you should see the playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.